Give them my back. Yes. Wait for others to come or to start? Okay. May I have your attention, please? For those of you who are having your coffee, we're ready to start. And those of them outside, they just come. Hi, George. I feel I'm talking to you here, but I really have to be looking this side. And I'm sorry for the others that I'm giving you my back. But I just wanted to tell you welcome, and that we are very honored and also very grateful that you have awakened so early to share with us your the workshop that you're going to give it to me. Let me tell everybody else a little bit about George. He researches technology, networks, analytics, and openness in education. He's a professor and executive director of the Learning Innovation and Networked Knowledge, that's LINK, the LINK Research Lab at the University of Texas at Arlington. He has delivered keynote addresses in more than 35 countries on the influence of technology and media on education, organizations, and society. His work has been profiled in provincial, national, and international newspapers, including the New York Times, radio, and television. His research has been funded by the NSF, SHRC, I guess I don't know what that stands for, but managed, Intel, Boeing, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the Soros Foundation. He has received numerous awards, including honorary doctorates from Universidad de San Martín de Porres and Fraser Valley University, for his pioneering work in learning, technology, and networks. He holds an honorary professorship with the University of Edinburgh, and he is a founding president of the Society for Learning Analytics Research. He has advised government agencies in Australia, European Union, Canada, and the United States, as well as numerous international universities on digital learning and utilizing learning analytics for assessing and evaluating productivity gains in the educator sector and improving learner results. Finally, in 2008, he pioneered massive online courses, MOOCs, and he blogs at eLearn Space and on Twitter at G. Siemens. Thank you, Paul. It's a very impressive bio. And we're looking very much forward to your talk, especially here at AUC. I think we're starting something that you're way ahead of us, and we learn a lot from you, I'm sure. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the introduction. So hopefully y'all can hear me. I'm in a hotel somewhere in Atlanta. I've got an event I'm here for, so I apologize that I wasn't able to be there in person. Egypt is a country I've long wanted to visit. What I'm going to do now is share my screen. Last time I did this, it didn't work so well, so let's just see how things turn out here. I'm just going to go back and just get a thumbs up from someone in the front row. Did you see my PowerPoint up briefly? Yeah, I got a thumbs up. Awesome. Okay, so one of the things that you're going to have to do, because when you present in this particular environment, I don't see any of you. Usually Zoom or something, you see a little corner, so I know what's going on. So at this point, I'm literally just looking at my screen. So if there's any problems, somebody will either need to grab a mic and speak at me or do something along those lines. This is an odd feeling of speaking into a void. I'm going to talk not so much about my title here, but a series of questions that I'm grappling with these days, and things that remain quite uncertain for me, and the challenge that I think has for our education system. I've been doing this talking routine here for a number of years, and I start with a few core slides that's really animated my own thinking, and that's the first two here. One is this idea that higher education is complexifying, that the needs of our students, the needs of our system are complex and ongoing, and that the traditional narrative that we've used isn't going to suffice. It's not broad enough, it's not inclusive enough, it's not sufficient enough. And so the idea then is that a university and the notion of a university is expanding and diversifying. And I've made that equation somewhat to this idea that the education system of tomorrow needs to mimic the architecture of information today. And again, this is a sort of a core argument that I've used in presentations for over a decade in various ways. But it's just that if we want to think about what will learning look like tomorrow, then we need to sit back and look at what information architecture looks like today. And a few of the attributes that I've often shared, and these are generally all positive. It's open, it's distributed, it's scalable, it's social, we interact, we connect with one another, and so on. It's networked and self-organizing. That approach, all of these are generally positive things. Most of us wouldn't assume that information being open is a bad thing, or that information that has social read-write capabilities is a bad thing. So I've always sort of had this view that this is the future of education. These are all positive, happy attributes. And that, as I noted, if we want to get a hold of or get our arms wrapped around what tomorrow's system will look like, then we should sit down and reflect deeply on what is the architecture of information in terms of how it gets created, shared, iterated, who controls it, how is it controlled, which winners does it create, which losers does it create, in what ways does it contribute to inequity in society more generally, in what way does it oppress some people, in what way does it free some people. These are all foundational questions that we need to tackle and that we need to look at. And so I'll run through I guess, a series of questions that vex me at some levels, or that at least I'm trying to better understand. And I think it makes for me as well a fairly significant shift that's been going on for the last several years. I haven't been as involved with Keynote presentations, and I haven't been as active with blogging, and I generally just use Twitter to rage. And so it sort of marks, the conversation here marks, I think, what's been a behind the scenes transformation, or at least alteration in my own thinking and my own values based on what we know now, compared to what we knew in the heyday of Web 2.0 and blogging and so on, and what the landscape looks like today. So first of all, what do networks do? I think at its fundamental level, networks make things smaller. They take what used to be an album and they make it a song, or they take what used to be a textbook and they make it a short blog post, or what used to be a 1-hour lecture and they make it a 3-minute YouTube video. So networks have a granularizing effect, and that's because the smaller the pieces are that connect, the greater the options are for reconnection. It's much easier to bring in a quote into your doctoral dissertation than it is to bring in an entire book. And so because networks allow for that kind of granularization and that kind of connection, that's sort of one of their primary attributes. In theory, networks also promote democracy. But in reality, as we're finding these days, that networks also promote the ability for systems to subvert democracy and to challenge the idea of equity. We at one point felt, hey, everybody should have a voice. That's one of the calling cards of early 2000 to mid 2000s, where this idea of Web 2.0 was, hey, everybody gets a chance to share their opinion. People can be front and center at the scene of an accident when it first happens, and everything is terrific. But we're finding now that not everybody should have a voice. There are people who have sort of hate-filled mindsets, or who are antagonistic to the rights and the values of others, that maybe shouldn't be given an opportunity to say whatever they want on Twitter or on Facebook and so on. And also that there are government agencies that are eager to influence elections in other parts of the world that are more amenable to their worldview and so on. So networks do promote democracy, but they are also now capable of subverting democracy simply by flooding and overwhelming the landscape. It's like after you've seen 400 shocking things happen in a short span, the 401st shocking thing isn't that shocking anymore. And that's an effect of networks. They also pick winners. And this is the idea of Pareto's principle, which is 80% of the results come from 20% of the effort. Or if you look at in terms of power laws, the idea that Google gets a lot more links to their site than what I get to my own. And so networks have this interesting mix that I used to think were all exclusively positive. I would say for about a decade, I just couldn't picture networks as being negative. And now it's becoming very clear that they are. that while it's good that they granularize entities so they can be reused, it's good that they give voice to everyone. But there's also negative attributes that we're just starting to experience at a profound way societally. Another drawback is that networks or groups also have the ability to both enable and destroy autonomy. And some early work on this, and this goes back to the 1950s, looked at what happens if you take three, let's say a group of lines, and then you have individuals who are Confederates, namely they know what the study is about, and you put them together with a group of people in the study, and then they intentionally say, even though you can clearly see one line is longer than the others, but they, by having peers give the wrong answers, the peers being the Confederates, the ones who were in on the study, then the individuals that come by and are part of this group discussion, they'll, even though their eyes 100% confirm that one line is a different length than the other, they'll choose the wrong answer. 3 out of 4 people will do this at least once for the duration of a study, and at least 1 out of 4 people will do it up to 50% of the time, in order to feel connected to the group, which means that we give up our autonomy to be related to a group. We find this in Twitter all the time, is that we say things that we have others tweet and retweet, and we acquire the values of the groups or the networks that we're a part of, which isn't a bad thing, but it does mean that we, as we're involved in these group environments, we willingly sacrifice some degree of autonomy in order to be a part of this broader network or system. So that's a quick overview. Networks, both good and bad, which is a recent revelation for, I think, much of society. So let's turn to learning. What is learning? Well, there's a number of different quotes that address this. It's a change in human disposition and capability. It persists over time, and it's not a function of just regular personal growth. It means there's an intentional effort. It could be through self-reflection, or it could be through a process of being taught. Or the broad statement of its gaining knowledge and expertise. One of my favorites, and Driscoll's work, she's one of the folks that really first motivated my interest in thinking about the theories of learning. In fact, it was in response to one of her texts that I started putting the article I did in 2004 on connectivism. But her argument is that it's a persisting change in human performance or performance potential. And that comes about as a result of the learner's experience and interaction with the world. I threw some thinking on this, a few years ago, but it's this process of acquiring knowledge that happens in a complex information space, and it's the intent of connected specializations that enable us to learn more and do more rather than what we currently know, namely that learning resides outside of ourselves rather than just simply within our own minds. So basically learning then, by any of those definitions, is there some aspect of growth that's not a function only of biological. There's a degree of will and volition, and there's an expansion in our capability as a result of having undergone that process. And I'll sort of start tying a few of these together shortly. So how networks then impacted education? So we have this rough view of learning as an intentional activity that may or may not happen within ourselves and broadly within our technological environment. And we have this hot and cold aspect to networks, good and bad. Well, I think networks have really influenced education by increasing learner agency. There's a lot of recognition now of the value of students being in control, students owning their own spaces of learning, students being able to move forward at a level that they're interested in. Learning, say, recent study that was done by Kaggle found that 59% of people working in data science had learned their data science skills either through the experience of self-learning or through MOOCs. So that means one of the hottest fields in society, fastest growing field with ridiculous economic gains in terms of the salaries paid by, to data scientists. Individuals learn, up to 59% of them learned this through MOOCs or through just self-study. So it's really that sense of agency that we can learn what we need to know. There's also a fascinating aspect that networks have done to education is it's produced sort of conflict and agreement between conservatives and progressives. And I mean this in an interesting way in that the progressives have become conservatives and the conservatives in some cases have become progressives. I remember in 2006, 2007, I started reading Jacques Ellul, The Technological Society, and pushing back, and even Neil Postman and others, but pushing back at this idea that technology is good, that it's naturally a positive. And I remember at that point that, there's an overwhelming narrative of, technology and more technology. And now we have social progressives who have become technological conservatives, recognizing that there are things that technology does to our social fabric and to our society that need to be evaluated critically, or in some cases just outright restricted. And so that's a fascinating outcome, is that the social progressives have become the technological conservatives, and that individuals who would be conservative socially have become, advocates, strong advocates of technological progressivism. So it's one of those things that's hard to wrap your head around exactly, who plays what role, in that we don't fit in these tight boxes as well as we perhaps thought we did. And also, it's moved education towards market-based footing. This is significant, and it's global. It's not just an American phenomena, even though it's most pronounced here. So a big question, and probably one of the biggest questions that I've been thinking about lately, is what's left when technology outcognitions humans? And that's, a bad word, but I don't know how else to describe, when technology outthinks us and outperforms us. We've seen in artificial intelligence, it's easy to kind of dismiss it as a lot of hype and overhype, but there are fascinating outcomes with things like AlphaGo. And I'm just going to quickly move to this image. You should see all of you there. Here's an illustration of AlphaGo 0. So before I go, this is just a slide as a holder until I bring it up. So as you're aware, it took about 30 some years, if not longer, for the original Go 5, the good old fashioned artificial intelligence, to transition to something that was, more reflective of networked attributes, to eventually it was able to beat a human chess player. Go, which is a more complex game than chess, took quite a bit longer. And in fact, it took years after chess was first mastered by technology for Go to be mastered by technology. And then eventually you had AlphaGo that performed this, and then and all of these systems were developed by feeding formal and informal gameplay patterns to this AI system, which would learn what people did and what worked and what the outcome of it was. AlphaGo 0 came along with a very different mindset. AlphaGo 0 was basically just said, here, technology system, these are basic rules. You play against yourself. You figure the game out. We're not going to teach the game to you, unlike previous versions, which were fed examples of how the game was played and how the game had been won by top masters. AlphaGo 0 was just basically said, here's a couple of basic rules. You play yourself and figure it out. This is the outcome. So it starts off 0 days, AlphaGo, they don't, no knowledge of the game, just basic rules. It starts to run up and play against itself. It learns only from itself, no human involvement. Then it starts to beat the first AlphaGo system from 2016 at day 3. It keeps going forward again, no human involvement, it taught itself. Day 21, it hits the new peak level, and it keeps outperforming any of the other systems that have been out there. By day 40, AlphaGo has beat every single version. AlphaGo 0 has defeated every single version of AlphaGo, and it's become the best Go player in the world, meaning that it's a system that taught itself. Humans didn't teach AlphaGo 0 the way that it taught other systems. So it's this idea that we've made a lot of advancement for artificial intelligence in spaces such as speech recognition and some very domain-specific activities, such as the recognition of cancerous tissues in mammograms or so on. It's succeeded well at that, but not so much at general knowledge in the daily lives that we live. But it certainly indicates that if in a period of 40 days, it can achieve what previously took systems years to do, that there's something qualitatively different about this type of intelligence that can teach itself. Now, initially, I thought, well, with networks and with technology and with the growth of all of these new tool sets, that we would start to see this iterative model where we would have a traditional course structure, which would be lecture content, activities, assessment, credentialing, a linear timeline, with something that looked more connective and engaged, meaning that we would end up with a model where individuals can work in a structured manner, but also in a self-selected learner-controlled manner, where we have this oscillating learning path. We move between formal learning and learning that interests us and that's driven by our own passions and our own interest. And I'm curious now about what that might look like in this model of AI and AI systems going forward. And I think one of the fundamental things that vexes me is, what's the point of memory anymore? What's the point of committing things to memory when we can ask Siri or Google or Alexa to give us whatever information we need? I mean, when you think of how often, for those of you that might recall 10 or 15 years ago, half the fun of spending a night out with your friends in a pub was arguing things that you didn't have an answer to, which means everybody has their own ill-informed opinion, and you can spend a whole evening debating something that is known, but you didn't debate in order to get an answer necessarily. You debated for the process of the debate. And now somebody will say, hey, who was so-and-so? And you answer the question in 2 seconds using your smartphone. And so your pub conversation is done, rather than spending an hour debating, who is the best basketball player, or who was the best this or the best that. So it's an interesting aspect when memory is fully available to us in a fairly constant point. And that relates to something that I think technology is causing us to reflect on, is this idea of, will we die? I recently looked at Becker's classic text on the denial of death, this idea that and I've seen this in certain religious or spiritual thinking as well, around this idea that a big part of human experience is our denial of death, that we do things because we're unable to confront our own mortality, and we commit fascinating challenges in front of us due to our inability to say, this is our life and this is what it means to be a human. But will we die isn't necessarily only a physical question. It's a question of, death is a reset. It's when I die, a youth comes along and has to learn what I learned and what my generation learned and so on. And they'll learn different things. And by learning different things, there's a reset process that sort of purges some of the inefficiencies from the memory system. But with AI and with other systems, the power of exponential knowledge growth, and the reality is significant. And the reality is, we don't have to reset knowledge, the knowledge holder, the human being, or in this case, technology, to a beginning point. Unlike myself and many other people historically that seem to die, an AI model doesn't. It only learns. It never forgets. It always knows everything it's always known. And that's an interesting implication, because it means that the ability of AlphaGo 0, for example, to do in 40 days what has taken 40 years by previous system is a provocative challenge, because after AlphaGo 0, you're going to have a new version that's going to learn it in 20 days or in 10 days or in 5 minutes. And so this question then becomes that the mortality of human knowledge is a provocative question when the holder of knowledge no longer gets reset. So tying a few of these fuzzy ideas together, we start to look at, well, we're most likely then going to see in our generation, I don't think any one of us can really see much past our own generation and the current generation behind us, just because it's so challenging to have a comprehensive view of what this will look like going forward. There's so many variables at play here. But the general idea then is, what does a distributed technological cognition look like, where we work together with technology agents? We are one with the technology system that we're interacting with, and our future coworker has has an algorithm embedded in them because they're a robot, and they think differently and function differently than we do. And so it's this distributed technological cognition that we need to prepare for as an education system. Namely, what does artificial intelligence and human intelligence do when it works together? Who does what and when? And it's important also to be aware of that you don't necessarily want to scale through humans what can be scaled through technology. For example, inferring and detection in large scales of data sets is better handled through an AI approach. By the same account, You don't want to scale through technology what should be done by human beings, namely people who've had extensive engagement and classroom experience and are very strong or very capable of being able to assess or understand what an individual learner should know at this point in a particular program. Another question that continues to vex me is, how do we achieve clear learning through distributed means? So this idea that part of what a school system is, or part of what a university does, is it prepares students. And by preparing students, it has to have clear goals, learning outcomes or learning aims, or at least that's what we think it has to have. But how do we do this in a distributed manner where students have a lot of choice? This is something that CNN and politics in the US in particular is experiencing. In the past, we would get home, watch a news program that wasn't recorded. There were no recordings or TiVos or any other options. If you didn't catch the news at 6 o'clock, you didn't watch the news unless you had a VCR hooked up to watch that. But now we don't get our news that way. In fact, I cannot recall the last time I've sat down and watched a news program other than incidentally at an airport or in a hotel. Almost always we get it through bits and pieces of Twitter and social media and traditional media and an article in the New York Times and so on. So the same impact exists in our educational setting. No longer do we necessarily experience a course in its entirety, but instead we are experiencing things through distributed approaches. It's coming at us in bits and pieces here and there and in a fragmented way. How do we assess for that? How do we integrate these diverse experiences in a way that allows us to say, this student has learned this thing and we're sure of it? In the past, if we controlled the instructional and the assessment pipeline, we would have greater confidence that students knew what we wanted them to know. We don't control that pipeline anymore. We still control the assessment part of it, but we don't control the input pipeline, and that makes it challenging to root out inefficiencies or errors in learners' knowledge. Another question on the future of the university system is, what role will corporate providers play? And the short answer is a growing role. I can't see really a sector in society where we won't have greater and greater corporate involvement. The success of the corporate learning marketplace in the US in particular has really, it's been incredibly successful for the corporate players. Part of it's due, some of you may be familiar with the idea of disaster capitalism, or this general notion that when there's failings in public systems, then you give credit, you open up the opportunity for competition. One of the things that I've seen over the last while is, as many of you are probably aware, but Elon Musk and SpaceX and the commercialization of spaceflight. What a lot of individuals accredit is the power of corporate performance, getting things into space that, as we're all aware, NASA and other agencies did 30 or 40 years ago with the same public funds, because SpaceX isn't self-funded. SpaceX receives heavy public funds for the kinds of work or initiatives that they're doing. In fact, in some ways, they bleed some of the support that might go to something like NASA. And so we've privatized public exploration. And when this was coming out, there's a lot of people lauding the incredible work that Elon Musk has done, and it is incredible work. And I tweeted out and I said, we instead of being proud of ourselves, the way that we were proud when NASA landed somebody on the moon, we're now proud of Elon Musk. And that's a qualitative shift in what happens when you privatize public goods. You lose the affection or the identity that comes with being a part of something, and instead you become you have confidence in Google or in Facebook or in something else. And I don't mean to be anti involvement of corporate providers in the education space. Education is so complex. Most universities lack leadership and vision to be able to meet those challenges head on. We have to engage with corporate partners to continue to stay relevant. But there's some fundamental questions that we're not asking ourselves on the role that these providers play in reshaping our society. Another aspect, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this, that I'm fascinated by is how do we do research, or how will we do research in a network distributed environment where human and machine intelligence intersects? So broadly speaking, knowledge is a pattern of connections, and new knowledge builds on or relates to what is already known. And innovation then is this experience of creating new connections or new results out of what already exists. A favorite example of mine is the rocket, the steam engine. It wasn't a thing that was created by itself. It was a thing that had thousands of threads from the beginning of human ingenuity to the time of its invention that came together and coalesced in the creation of this particular innovation. And these threads were things like steam and motion, and you actually needed some type of a intellectual property or copyright system to encourage investment, and you needed a climate that has greater use of entrepreneurial environments and corporate, not corporate, but private funding to help make some of these go forward, and the list goes on. So you needed all of these things to come together over thousands of years. So the steam engine wasn't a thing that was invented the way we talk about rocket. Instead, what it was an example of a long-term process of millennia engagement in this advancement of human knowledge. And so it's worth noting that this whole process isn't like doing something from scratch, but it's more like stitching together known parts. Just like when someone says, Steve Jobs or Apple invented the iPhone, the answer is no, they compiled the iPhone. Much of the technological functionality existed in different places for decades, and it was really the compilation that made the innovation. And so it's this idea of network knowledge or combinatorial creativity that we combine and recombine these pieces to create new things that previously didn't exist, but we always recognize that we're doing so against this legacy of thousands of years of history. Now, more recently, when we transition this to a research conversation, we've had more attention paid to the sheer quantity of data, and this was some of the interest around the space of learning analytics. And the space of learning analytics builds on big data and data science and any number of these programs, but just fundamental argument that more is different, that more data requires a different mode of interacting. It's not new. Gessner in 1550 has this idea that, there's a confusing and harmful abundance of books. And that's an experience that we still have today, but we're turning now to metrics or big data models or approaches to make sense of that confusing and harmful abundance of books or ideas or resources. And that's reflected in a bit of a seminal paper in this space from 2009 around the unreasonable effectiveness of data. This idea that data creates new methods or takes new approaches in how we solve the educational challenges. And the data that we have with our students is their involvement in our learning management system, student information system data, and a range of other sources that we can include in analyzing student performance. Some of it's a little icky, such as the use of mobile phone data, student swipe cards. We'll talk about this later, but physiological data that also starts to have an impact on what we can understand about our students. Now, the traditional scientific method, though, is not capable of dealing with the complex interdependencies that exist within social systems. And as a result of that, learning and learning spaces ideally need something that is more nuanced and more complex than a traditional scientific method, but also something that is more diverse than what we see happening in the learning analytics space specifically. But that also raises a core question about what is it that we want research to do in learning environments. A lot of the research that we talk about in other spaces are more clear. So in engineering, you have a particular goal or mandate or whatever else that you want to achieve with engineering work and research. But in education, there's a tight link to things such as activism. And we want to not just understand the world, but in a Marxian sense, we want to change it. And so there's an interesting question on what is activism look like in a research role educationally, and what does sort of peer-reviewed rigorous traditional research play in that same learning process. One of the articles that I read, and I should probably be a nicer human being, but sadly I'm not, and I didn't include the author's name, though anyone could Google it, but this paper that I recently read looked at at chairs that haunt the lives and give contradictory messages to people of comfort, power, and suffering. The chair is a trace, a symbol, an instrument of torture, and an object of desire. So this author was eventually in one of the images pictured with her posing with a chair that she sat on when she was a child. And this was a peer-reviewed academic article that was trying to address the idea of furniture in classrooms. And so needless to say, I found this interesting as an example of scientific progress. By the same account, we can sort of make fun of, or at least I can, some of the softer methods that we see utilized in the education landscape that sometimes produces work that is perhaps not of the most significant quality. By the same account, you have others, and one of the big ones going on now is a replication crisis. That's a huge issue in psychology, and one of the individuals, it's quoted on the screen here, is at the center of it with work that he did out of his lab. It was a food and health lab, basically, that drew a bunch of interesting correlation between how much people eat at a buffet related to price, and tried to and did publish in top journals fascinating outputs of his research work in his lab. But unfortunately, and this is the mindset that he had, is an email that he had written to a student, said, "I don't think I've ever done an interesting study where data came out the first time I looked at it." And since then, he's been accused of a number of things, having been very successful as an academic in terms of grants and publications in the top journals, that he engaged in practices of p-hacking or unethical approaches to data manipulation that made the research say things or the data say things that it really shouldn't have said. So somewhere you have this intersection between activism that is perhaps not of a high quality technical rigor, but by the same account, you have the flip side, which is technically sophisticated analysis that's outright manipulation. And so we need to find our space in that around research spaces or research questions. Another question I think that we need to look at faces the idea of financing this model. There's been a growing movement in some regions that addresses the idea of free tuition or public supporting tuition without expense to the end user. Unfortunately, much of that has a habit of favoring the middle class or the upper middle class. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it for that reason, but it does mean that disproportionate gains of free tuition go to individuals who actually have a chance of being able to afford it. So making education free isn't necessarily the only solution we need to look at. In fact, you look at a country like Germany, which doesn't have tremendously high post-secondary completion rates, at least not in comparison with countries like Canada or Australia. And they have essentially free tuition. So there's something more at play that involves support and development for human beings in this kind of an environment, because they're the ones that are facing difficulties with these systems or with these models. It's not only an economic problem, it's a life circumstance. Now, there have been some initiatives that are growing attention in the US, voucher-based systems, heavy public support. The UK made a bit of a disaster of their transition to the American model, and places like Australia are eager to at least mimic part of the UK experience and model. And so we're looking at a US transition, which is education is increasingly becoming a private good and hence needs to be fully funded by the individual engaging in the education. With, again, and this is the odd part of the education world today, is that people, or systems I should say, that like Tennessee, that is not necessarily the epicenter of enlightened thinking by traditional liberal arts mindsets, actually has a free college initiative that is expected to give individuals at least certain salary or income levels access to free learning. So it's this idea that our systems are becoming more dichotomous on a number of fronts, not really playing to the established sort of markets or approaches that we would expect them to play to. But what is that financing need then? Is it, community colleges that have labor market impact should all be publicly funded, whereas universities which pay attention to the development of the whole person should be privately funded, meaning we'll pay to prepare people for industry, meaning we're helping industry become more effective. There's that notion of capitalist support. Or do we pay for the development of humans to be part of a democratic, egalitarian, equitable society through more of a traditional liberal arts education, which is not being covered under free tuition models? So some approach between a voucher system to a tuition-based model to full public support to private versus public good relationships remains significant and outstanding. Now, this last section of slides that I want to go through will sort of argue for a bit of a shift. As I mentioned earlier, these are questions that have animated my thinking for the last several years about what becomes of the human experience in an age where the technology, so to speak, is smarter than us, even though many of the statements are over declared, but it's still enough trajectory there that we need to recognize due to automation, artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, and so on, that we're going to encounter a dramatically different economic future than we might have experienced in the past. So one of the things that I think is a reality that I've certainly experienced myself, and I assume all of you have as well, is that we know things, we know more things than we used to, but we're less aware of the meaning. And my experience on this was when I first started blogging in the late 90s, early 2000s. I would do talks at conferences around the value of blogging and why we should blog. And it was a way to stay on top of information that wouldn't be covered until the evening news and so on. And so my argument really was we get to know things faster when we are involved in social media. And we didn't call it social media at that time. But that was the benefit of being involved in these kinds of tool sets. But now I think we look at it and we're like, you know, the issue isn't knowing things anymore, because we know a lot. Like it's rare that you'll sit down with somebody and say, hey, have you heard about this new tool? Which that was entirely what used to interest me about blogging, was I would find out stuff and new tools and new resources. But now people through Facebook and through Twitter and their networks and blogging and their daily email newsletters from different academic services or groups like the Chronicle Inside Higher Ed, we're all aware of all the things all the time. It's what we're not aware of is the meaning. We're not aware so much of the implication, but we know the new technologies and we know the new tool sets and we know the new buzzwords. And so the question becomes, back to my question earlier on, do we need memory? Maybe learning is best left to the machines. Maybe the vast majority of what we know as humanity, we might as well say, look, it's just like we stopped having to do manual division because a $4 calculator could do complex division and addition and multiplication in a way that far outperforms human capability. And so we just said, well, fine, this is what technology does better. Let's let it do that and we'll focus on other things. So there's a question. Maybe much of what we now do in our classroom is best managed by machines. And we turn our attention instead to a few things. One is the idea of wayfinding, sense-making, or meaning-making. But I'll turn to some of the meaning makings or the eudaimonia kind of perspective a little bit later on. But it's this idea that maybe our goal is to understand connections rather than our traditional curricular models that aren't based on that same framework. We need to look at even our experience with the world in general, that we focus less on what's the new thing in the new tool and more on what's the implication and the long-term meaning of it. And so sense making is basically this process where we try and stabilize the streaming of experience in a way that we can have a bit of a comment on it that allows us to understand implications. And it's this idea of we're always changing, but we're never focused on the becoming. You know, what are we becoming in these kinds of processes that we're perpetually and continually engaged in? Now, we then, and we see this through social media, Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and Snapchat and so on, but we see this regularly. And the idea then is that we engage in social sense-making practices through stories and narratives and knowledge exchange. That's how we try to make sense of our world. We share our piece of the world, our perspective of the world. Or somebody says, hey, I think this new change in Twitter is bad for this and this population because we no longer have to think of a single homogenous group. We can think in diverse and multifaceted ways. as I mentioned earlier, technology breaks things down. It makes things more granularized. And so we're able to have individuals make sense of their world and share their sense making through stories and narratives on social media. Then we turn to technical approaches, the human intelligence, artificial intelligence relationship, when the data exceeds our capacity to create a social discourse around it. But even then, we still end up having to return to social sense-making practices in order to share the outcomes of that analysis and what the meaning of that is. So this is actually, I guess, the only slide that matters. So basically, I bored the crap out of you for the last 45 minutes. But what I'm arguing then is our education system needs to shift to being attributes. Technology can know things more than people can. It can out-memorize us, out-learn things, but it can't out-be us. And so it's this idea of a shift to being attributes that the education system needs to focus on the developmental parts of us, not just the cognitive part of us. It's something that's variously been, you can pronounce this however you want it. It's eudaimonia, it's eudaimonia, it's eudaimonia, depends on exactly, and there's a few different spellings of it, but it's an ancient Greek term that really addresses this idea of human flourishing or human well-being, but it's this thing, are we successful people, not necessarily what is it that we know. And it's worth also bringing to our attention again that the modern idea of universities as we have them, even though they've been around for 600-700 years, the modern framework of it being primarily a developmental space for, say, employment is a couple 100-year-old framework. Much of what universities did in the past didn't even have a grading system the way we experience it today. It was, if you studied with Kant, then you're like, oh yeah, okay, Kant doesn't put up with idiots. So obviously, by virtue of having studied with him, capability was ascribed. But today, much of the university system is a process of hoop jumping, and in many cases, we hear this idea of useful knowledge, namely knowledge that can be turned into economic gain. But as others have said as well, if one person could develop a platform or a tool that can generate billions of dollars in revenue, such as, say, Apple's iPhone does, then you don't need as many people necessarily toiling away in those spaces. The economic value being unlocked by one innovation technically could provide the well-being or the resource needs of hundreds of thousands or millions of people. And this is sort of the idea behind the universal basic income, which has its own share of problems, but it's beyond the scope of what I want to look at now. The idea I'm trying to get at is that well-being, not cognition, is perhaps the space on which education needs to orient its new role in society. And this is a challenging thing because we're increasingly disconnected from things that matter. We have a technology mediating agent between many of our vital life experiences. One illustration that I often think about is many of us, and certainly many of our children, have never had the satisfaction of say, killing a chicken or having to kill a farm animal for food consumption. And it means you walk into a grocery store and you pull out a chicken breast and you have no awareness that this used to be a living thing, or if it is, it's there's no emotional identity to the fact that this used to be a living thing, which is not entirely, I think, or is probably reasonably responsible for 40% of food in the US is thrown out because we don't have a relationship to food the way we did in the past. I grew up on a farm in Mexico, and when you killed a chicken, for example, that was a meal for quite a while. It was impacted in the soups, it was impacted in the broth, it was impacted in whatever you did. So this idea then that we should focus on is I think critical, recognizing that we need to become connected to what matters, not to be so removed from it that we no longer ascribe value because we just expect it to be there. And one example is just our appreciation for nature. If you haven't spent time walking in the woods or experiencing a rainforest, you have a different perspective on what should be exploited for economic gain and what should be preserved. One of the initiatives to try and get at this that I've been working with Kristen Eschleman is we initially wanted to call it Walk the Talk, but Walk the Talk was taken as a URL. So it's Trek the Talk now. But we have a series of events that we're planning that are, instead of sitting in a classroom and talking to other people or in a conference hall, we start with a hike, a 6 hour to a full day hike where you have a small group of people who have a series of questions that they're debating, and then you rotate groups through as you go through the hike. You do meet back in a classroom later on at the end of the day or the next day to crystallize what you discussed. But it's this idea of get out and experience the things that are becoming less real to us, namely nature and namely being outdoors and being connected without technology as a mediating agent. Maybe one of the things that we're going to start to see going forward is the same way that we have physical gyms and physical spaces, that we'll start to see the development of something that looks more like mind gyms. And by mind gyms, I'm looking at the idea that there's a place where you can go and figure out how to think, because I think many of us were not equipped with how to use our minds. That's one of the reasons why there's been a lot of attention paid to things like mindfulness or meditative practices in school classrooms, at least, which is by the time we start using our brains, which is literally at birth, no one has given us instruction on how to appropriately control thoughts, release thoughts, manage stress, de-stress, how to recognize wellness generally, whether it's physical, emotional, and mental wellness. And they're not individual things. Our body is our mind is our body. And so it's this idea that maybe we'll end up in the future. It's like, oh yeah, instead of, at the end of work, I've got to go for a run. It's like, I've got to go practice improving my thinking skills. And, I'm not being entirely facetious with this type of a statement, but those are just sort of thoughts to possibly look at. Future education systems also need to do a far better job of modeling student learning across multiple domains, not only cognitive. There needs to be a strong emphasis on metacognitive, affect, social components as well. And the assessment of student practitioners in the university system needs to account for those complex, multifaceted domains. It also needs to, and so a couple of these are research projects that we're currently working on, including personal learning graphs, the idea of lifelong and life-wide learning, where learning happens in any space, but it gets credentialed in a central area, which is a tool set developing with the colleagues Shane Dawson and Dragan Gasevich. ProSolo is the tool set, but it's and we've piloted it with a couple of different courses on campus and also online courses and MOOCs. But we're, again, emphasizing this concept that we learn globally and accredit locally. So it doesn't matter where you learn, but the credentialing happens within a local system. Also, greater trends related to affect. I've already mentioned mindfulness, but the recognition of emotion, new literacy, and paying attention to some of the psychophysiological data capture needs that are available to us, but is worth emphasizing. There's some significant privacy and ethical constraints that related to it. Also paying a lot more attention to, right now we talk about developing learner knowledge, and as I mentioned earlier, it's about developing the learner. So that instead of paying attention to personalized learning systems, we really try and, or even adaptive learning, what we try and foster is learners who are capable of being adaptive. Keep in mind, the things that are easiest for technology to duplicate are the things that our current education system does for us today. It puts out set structured knowledge that we memorize, duplicate, regurgitate back. And yet we're suggesting that perhaps that's an antiquated approach, and what we should anticipate instead is something that is much more focused or emphasized, the need for individuals to develop their capability for being continually adaptive or continual learners in this kind of environment. So on that note, I am going to stop sharing and just see if there are any questions, because I probably talked too long.
Thank you, George. Yeah, questions?
Hello, I'm Alessandra. I don't know where I'm Alessandra Garego. I don't know if you can see me from John Cabot University in Rome. Okay, hi. I look that way. Okay. I was just very interesting talk, and I was just wondering. To some extent, I feel that the last points that you made are intrinsic to the humanities approach to education. Literally, all of them. I was going, we don't, I know if we need to do that in the future. I feel like that is what we do. And I was wondering from, if you had anything to say about that. Do you think that we're really not doing that in that way?
Well, I think first of all, it's important to emphasize, there's really nothing new. All the good ideas have already been had, and all we're trying to do is rehab them in our own time. Hence you bring in a Greek word like eudaimonia, and you're like, well, these clowns sitting in their little togas and hanging out in the beautiful sunlit Greek islands, they've already had this idea, and they've already understood that that's what matters. By the same account, the traditional liberal arts education is very much central to this. It's not new, but then you look at the traditional liberal arts education, and that also comes out of some of the traditional Greek thinking or any of the religious traditions that emphasize a contemplative, aware, self-focused life. So it's one of the difficulties with labeling things is that we're like, well, we've solved it. But we haven't. We haven't solved it for our age. Somebody solved liberal arts education for the 1870s through to 1950s, and then corporate culture emerged, and then we started to see a more work-based approach to education. So no, we haven't solved the liberal arts thing from that lens. Just like there were periods where in much of human history where it was developmental attributes were the primary interests of knowledge processes, even in the development of early universities, but certainly with traditional philosophers, it was the development of a certain type of person. There's a lot of attention, even with Stoicism, in how you are in relation to the world. But as society moved forward, eventually we did have the Industrial Revolution, then those things fell away, and all of a sudden we have to rediscover the big ideas. And so that's the idea I mentioned as well, that we need to return to understand what matters, what's critical, not what's more ephemeral. Our university system today mainly teaches ephemeral skill sets. It needs to cash out in terms of labor market, economic, or some type of a productivity metric. We don't necessarily capture out and say, well, George lived his life well. There's really no metric for that, even though I know some, PISA or other type of initiatives are trying to add that level to it. So long way around to say, yes, we have solved the problem that you're suggesting, but we just haven't solved it for our era. Previous eras solved it for their own. And through the lens of liberal arts education, we're at that stage of trying to rethink or rediscover what that looks like in a technological age where AI and human intelligence coexists.
Thank you. You have other questions? If you don't ask, I'm going to ask. Okay, so I have a question, because one of the things you said, George, was shift from cognition, teaching cognition to being, and I think more towards the emotion and the psycho. And my issue with that is that I think with technology and AI, they're trying to get the computer to do that for us too. And I think you'd probably share those ethical concerns about those kinds of things, like trying to get the computer to detect your emotions, to sort of respond to them, and I'm not really sure what you said earlier also about this trying to scale with technology what should be scaled with human beings. And can you let me know what you think of certain trends in that area? If there are particular technologies that are trying to do that, what you think of those?
Yeah, I mean that's a really consequential challenge. Is recognizing that we are not doing an excessively good job of keeping that space between what does a human do well and what does a technology do well. And part of the reason is it's economic, meaning somebody's trying to sell you something. which is why they would like you to use their tool. And universities that have experimented with emotion detection, there was a recent thing in Inside Higher Ed that addressed this as well, about a system that had developed or was working with, I think, Microsoft to determine the emotions of students. There's a platform that we use in our research lab at UT Arlington called iMotions that does emotion detection, eye tracking. It does a range of psychophysiological data such as brain waves and galvanic skin response and heart rate variability. And so it does a lot of these different types of data sources are being included. I think where we don't quite know is, first of all, manipulating emotions. Is a fuzzy area, even though we know that companies do that all the time, and we know that governments do that all the time, and we know that our friends do it, and we definitely know our parents do it, or our mother at least does it. So the idea of nudging behavior isn't unique, but it's more technologically oriented than it's ever been. And I remember being in a discussion with Dave Snowden, who's done some work on sense making. We were talking about AI, and his argument was, it's not that AI is going to necessarily surpass human intelligence. It's that we're going to dumb down human intelligence to the point where AI can duplicate it. And that's what our education system is doing, right? As we use people to use more and more technologies, we're training people to think like a technology. And I think that's definitely a bit of an issue, but there's a lot of ethical components here that really need to be reflected, because I'm more interested, and I think we as a society, even though our university system doesn't honor it today, and even society doesn't value the people that we enjoy not necessarily for their intelligence, but for their beingness, this vague entity of who a person is. And those are the things that our university system doesn't address at all. And yet that's probably more important than any aspect in terms of academic success. People have tried to give it different names, sexy names that sell books, like grit, growth mindset, but these are all affective attributes that indicate some orientation that an individual has toward a certain type of thinking or values of thinking. And so I do think we're going to see much more uncomfortable stuff coming in, because through positive psychology and a few of these other domains that are paying attention to the affective attributes of being human, we're going to see greater and greater attention being paid to how do we instantiate or technologize the articulation of affect and emotion. So I'm with you. It's an uncomfortable space, but I think these days nothing good comes that technology doesn't try to own.
Oh my God, they're going to try to measure it and box it.
Of course. And they are already. It's not just that they will, it's that they are.
They are. Anybody else have any questions? Okay. Yes. Yes.
I'm Ruxana from Pakistan. I think, like the previous speaker, definitely, I think the idea you present of education for well-being, human well-being, is a very powerful idea. But just to share that, the concept of well-being is somehow, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the luxury of the people who are actually economically well off. And when you start thinking of well-being and culture and so many other beautiful things of life, when you're not worried about the economics in your own, setup around you, and for them, employability and making money and having resources does become a very strong read. But there was a dilemma. 20 years ago, I was working with an NGO that worked on literacy for rural communities, totally impoverished. And we noticed that they were dropping out of school and they wouldn't come to school. And every time we went to talk to parents and we'd say, we want you to send your child to school, their basic question was, but the education is not going to get us the job. So why should we send the children to school? And so we in the NGO had to put our heads together. And honestly, the only answer we came up was that education might not get you a job, but it will tell you how to live your life within the resources you have and make the best of it. And that started to, we would then give examples that you would know what to eat, to have the right meals, how to do hygiene, just to keep your environment clean. Your resources might not increase, but your capability to use your resources will be far more effective and will change your life. And you're somehow saying the same thing, and it delights me that it's coming from a different paradigm of, in the countries you live with. It doesn't deal with that sort of poverty and impoverishment of resources, but that was great listening to your talk, and thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments. And I should also say this is one of the difficulties that you're absolutely right. There is this mindset that says only well-off people can focus on things like well-being. And I think there is a bias toward people in poverty that suggests that people in poverty need different things than people who are not in poverty. And you can call it Maslow's hierarchy of needs or whatever you wish to call it. But there is, I think, an important argument to be made that if somebody is wealthy enough to afford a luxury like self-awareness and self-thought, then we should also recognize that that is a basic human need in the same, and that it shouldn't be, which I have seen come out. This is part of my challenge with the free college tuition in some high poverty states in the US, is that the intent is to say, all right, poor people, we're going to teach you this stuff. You can be a plumber and electrician, but because you're poor, you can't think about the meaning of life and how to order yourself in relation to the ethical values of a particular era. That's the thing that I find disconcerting, is it's this bias that poor people don't need the same meaningful opportunity for life reflection that wealthy people might have.
Thank you. Thank you, George. We're going to let you go start your day now. Thank you so much for the time to meet us.
Everybody. Okay, we'll see you. Bye-bye.